Hello, and welcome to the Inclusion of Special Populations Training 703 KAR 5:070. My name is Krista Mullins, and I am a program consultant in the Office of Assessment and Accountability. This training consists of 4 sections: inclusion, general conditions, section specifics, and conditions for specific accommodations. This training must be completed prior to providing accommodations for any state-required assessments. The support materials that you receive for this regulation training include Inclusion of Special Populations in the State-Required Assessment and Accountability Programs Regulation, this PowerPoint, and the training videos. These may be accessed on the Assessment Regulations Training webpage. This regulation was updated in April 2021, and this training and documents reflect the most recent updates. The state-required assessment and accountability programs are inclusive of all students at specific grade levels. The purpose of this regulation is to provide direction for the inclusion of special populations in the state-required assessment and accountability programs. This training will discuss the populations included in this regulation, general conditions for accommodations, and specifics for each accommodation. Throughout this presentation, when you see page numbers referenced, they correlate to the page where you can find the information in the regulation. Let's begin with the introduction to the regulation. The General Assembly is committed to ensuring that every student has the opportunity to succeed in school. The Inclusion of Special Populations regulation describes student populations who may need accommodations to be successful. Accommodations are intended to provide support for students during instruction to access and learn content, as well as to demonstrate content achievement during assessment. Accommodations do not reduce learning expectations and are not intended to be a substitute for specific instruction. Accommodations shall be individualized and specifically designed to aid the student as the student learns. Special populations defined in this regulation include students with disabilities who have an individual education program or IEP, students who attend alternative programs and state agency children, students whose primary language is not English or EL, students who receive home or hospital instruction, students who have a 504 plan, and students with temporary medical conditions who need accommodations for participation. The provisions in this document are applicable to all students except those who are 21 years of age or older who are part-time students attending less than 6 hours per day. Students enrolled in an adult GED program and are not officially enrolled in a Kentucky public high school. A student's IEP team or Admissions and Release Committee, ARC, must meet annually to determine a student's least restrictive environment and learning plan. The team will use data-driven results, observations, formative and summative assessment, as well as other determining factors to place a student and determine accommodations for state assessments. There are 3 options for inclusion in a state assessment. They are with no accommodations, which means an accommodation is not needed or the student is not eligible at the time of testing. Those with accommodations mean that the ARC or IEP team have met and developed the annual plan to include those accommodation types permitted for the student to utilize on the state assessment. The last option is alternate assessment, which means even with access to the necessary accommodations, the student is still unable to access the general curriculum in a manner equivalent to their peers. The ARC or IEP team would then complete the participation guidelines for the Kentucky alternate assessment and revisit their eligibility for that participation level on a year-to-year basis. A student's ARC is responsible for determining which accommodations, if any, are necessary to provide individualized supports. Let's take a look at some general conditions. School staff must make available to the student accommodations used consistently as part of routine instruction and classroom assessment, but may not instruct their students on when to use accommodations. Proctors may review with the student the accommodations in their IEP 504 plan, or Program Service Plan, or PSP. Remind students that proctors are there to provide the accommodations and revisit this information at the beginning of each test session. Students have the right to decline use of an accommodation. Once the student refuses the accommodations, the test administrator may only resume the use of the accommodation during that day of testing at the request of the student. If a student has adult provided accommodations, example, reader, scribe, or assistive technology, the adult or technology shall be in the testing room prior to testing and shall remain there during the testing period. Accommodations should always be based on individual student needs and not solely on their disability category. Not all students within a certain eligibility category require the exact same accommodations. Evaluation information and ongoing progress data should support the need for accommodations in the specified area of need. Accommodations shall be part of the student's ongoing instructional program and not introduced immediately prior to the state required content assessments. Caution shall be used prior to making IEP, 504 plan, or PSP changes related to accommodations near or within the state required content assessment window. Changes may occur based on the time an annual meeting is to occur. It is important that any change made is supported through data and evidence. The use of technology shall be the first accommodation considered before adult accommodations, for example, reader or scribe, if feasible. A shortage of workstations, software, physical space, or training shall not be used as a reason for failing to provide assistive technology as an accommodation. To ensure student needs are met, test administrators and parties involved with testing the student shall be informed of all accommodations of the most recent version of the student's IEP, 504 plan, or PSP prior to state required content assessments. Changes in the administration of the assessment or recording of student responses shall be consistent with the services identified on the student's IEP, 504 plan, or PSP. Every year, there are many allegations that include violations of the Inclusion of Special Populations regulation. There are several slides in this training that provide prevention tips and best practices to assist in successful assessment administration. The first best practice is to always make sure a student receiving accommodations has a current plan in place and that all test administrators and the student are aware of the most up-to-date accommodations listed in the plan. Those plans need to be locked in Infinite Campus so that the students will be included in any assessment roster pools. If a plan changes near an assessment window, be sure to document well within the plan and any conference summary the justification for the change. If an accommodation is on a student's plan, it must be provided. One frequently asked question is, if this accommodation is on the plan but the student hasn't used it all year, do we provide it? Yes, accommodations on a plan should be provided, and that is non negotiable. The team monitoring the student plan should be reviewing accommodations regularly to make sure they are appropriate and necessary for inclusion. It is never the decision of a test administrator whether the student does or does not receive their accommodations. This is the first check for understanding in this training. Please pause the video and read through these yes or no questions and then resume the video so we can discuss the answers. Number 1, are all special populations included in the state required assessment and accountability programs? The answer is yes. Those populations are defined on page 3 of the regulation. Question 2. Should a student with a specific learning disability in reading automatically receive a reader and scribe for accommodations? The answer is no. Accommodations are individual to each student and should not be a blanket set of accommodations based on a disability or English proficiency level. Pages 4 and 5 of the regulation. Question 3. Do students have the right to decline an accommodation? Yes. Page 4 of the inclusion regulation states that students may decline an accommodation. Question 4. Can a student plan change near an assessment window? Yes. A student plan may change when appropriate. If the meeting falls near an assessment window, be sure to document the justification for the change in any summary and within the plan. This can be found on page 5 of the regulation. Let's take a look at the inclusion of students. Some students receive accommodations dictated by an IEP. This information can be found on pages 8 through 13 of the regulation document. One of the focal points in this section is the importance of intentionally selecting accommodations based on evaluation information, observations, and progress monitoring data. When age appropriate, students should be involved in the selection and use of accommodations. Everyone involved with testing is required to complete the administration code training. This particular training, Inclusion of Special Populations, is designed for those providing accommodations. Many districts choose to train all testing staff in both regulations to increase the number of trained staff available to provide accommodations. Any person not working in a certified position who is providing accommodations for special populations shall read and sign a non-disclosure agreement provided by the department. Section 2 of the Inclusion of Special Populations regulation focuses on students who are identified as English learners or EL. This information can be found on pages 13 through 19 of the regulation document. Students who enter school and have English as a second language will be administered the home language survey as the first part of the screening process. If a student is determined to be an EL student, a district or school committee must convene to design a program service plan, or PSP, which determines instructionally consistent accommodations for the assessment administration. EL students do not receive accommodations on the annual English Language Proficiency Assessment unless they have a 504 or IEP. This is because that assessment measures the English language ability of the student. A student's score on the annual English Language Proficiency Assessment determines whether the student identified remains EL or attains English Language Proficiency status. For all EL students, PSP committees shall determine on an individual basis whether these students will participate with or without accommodations in the state-required assessment and accountability programs. Because those assessments measure content knowledge, these accommodations shall be related to demonstrating what each individual student knows on a test written in English and the ability to access the curriculum. Individuals providing assistance to a student with disabilities during the state-required content assessment shall be trained in their responsibilities yearly and sign a non-disclosure if not working in a certified position. All EL students must participate in the state-approved English language proficiency tests annually. This is regardless of time enrolled in a U.S. school. They must also participate in all state-required content assessments after one full year, which is defined as 240 cumulative days or 12 cumulative months. First-year EL students must participate in a mathematics test with appropriate accommodations if they are enrolled in a grade in which a mathematics test is administered. Likewise, they must participate in a science test with appropriate accommodations if they are enrolled in a grade in which a science test is administered. EL students in their first year of enrollment in a U.S. school qualify for a one-time exemption. Section 3 of the Inclusion of Special Populations regulation discusses students who have a 504 plan or medical emergency. This information can be found on pages 19 through 23 of the regulation document. Anyone who qualifies with a 504 must have a current plan. The 504 plan focuses more on use of an accommodation due to a health impairment instead of accommodations related to learning disabilities. The other part of this section focuses on medical emergencies. Examples include a student with a broken dominant arm or temporary paralysis due to illness who is now eligible for a scribe, or a student with a concussion who requires a human reader due to not being able to medically focus on a computer screen or paper test for a long period of time. Appropriate documentation must be kept on file at the school or district level and is not required to be submitted to KDE. Section 4 of the Inclusion of Special Populations Regulation focuses on students who receive services through an alternative program. This section also talks about the requirements of state agency children. This information can be found on pages 23 through 24 of the regulation document. Students attending programs classified as alternative programs shall be included in the overall accountability program system. Alternative programs are considered non-A1 or non-accountable programs. This does not always mean alternative placements for behavior. It applies to any alternative program that a student attends because that service is not available at their school or district of accountability, where they would be enrolled if they did not need that service. Kentucky School for the Deaf and Kentucky School for the Blind are examples of programs that provide programs to students who would not be able to receive those services at their school of accountability. State agency children, students who have been ordered or placed by the courts, are also expected to complete all state assessments unless an approved non-participation would apply. Section 5 of the Inclusion of Special Populations Regulation focuses on students who receive services in a homebound or hospital setting. This information can be found on page 24 of the regulation document. This does not include students who have withdrawn to homeschool. School personnel shall determine on an individual basis how each student will participate. The student may participate fully, or the district may seek a medical exemption. If participation in the state-required content assessment would jeopardize a student's physical, mental, or emotional well-being, a school or district shall submit a medical non-participation request. An identified disability or handicapping condition alone are not grounds for a medical non-participation. Requests are subject to KDE approval. Section 6 of the Inclusion of Special Populations Regulation focuses on students who participate in the Kentucky Alternate Assessment. This information can be found on pages 24 through 29 of the regulation document. Students who qualify for the Alternate Kentucky Summative Assessment, or AKSA, are not able to access the general curriculum in the same manner as their peers, even with access to accommodations. The content, while reflecting some grade content standards as peers, may need to be heavily modified for access and student demonstration of concepts. Students participating in the AKSA are expected to follow the same guidelines for use of accommodations. However, there are differences in the accommodations of reader and manipulatives. These students do not have to request a reread. They may also have labels but no content on their 3x5 note card. In order to participate in the AKSA, the ARC consider the participation guidelines established by the Kentucky Department of Education. A student may not qualify unless the ARC can answer yes to all parts of the guidelines. If a no is determined at any time, then the student would not qualify for participation. A direct link to those participation guidelines can be found on this slide. This allegation prevention or best practice tip is to highlight specific training requirements. First, anyone who is involved in a state assessment must receive the administration code training. Those providing or assisting with accommodations must receive the administration code and the inclusion of special populations trainings. Many districts do require both trainings to be completed by all test administrators and parties involved with state assessments. That is a local decision that may be enforced without the consent of KDE. It is time for our second check for understanding, which will cover information about students who are included in state assessments. Please pause the video and take a few minutes to read and answer these yes or no questions, and then resume the video so we can discuss. Number 1, do students who are in an alternative placement or state agency have to take the required assessments? The answer is yes. Students in alternative placements and state agency students have to take required assessments. This can be found on pages 23 and 24 of the regulation. Number 2, for EL students, is 1 year of enrollment defined as 240 cumulative school days or 12 cumulative months? The answer is yes. 1 year of enrollment is 240 cumulative school days or 12 cumulative months, found on page 15. Number 3, do districts have to send medical emergency documentation to KDE? The answer is no. Forms completed should be kept at the local level, page 19. Number 4, are students who have withdrawn to homeschool required to take the state required assessments? The answer is no. While students who receive homebound or hospital instruction are not automatically exempt from state required assessments, students who have completely withdrawn to be homeschooled are not required to complete state assessments. This includes students who may come to the school to receive services, such as speech or OT, but are not enrolled in that school for their primary enrollment. Page 24. Now we are going to discuss conditions for specific accommodations on state tests and the rules that govern what can and cannot be done when providing those accommodations as laid out by the Inclusion of Special Populations regulation. On the screen are the most used, but not only, accommodations allowed on state testing. We will discuss each one from the regulation individually. Assistive technology is allowed and encouraged on state testing. The assistive technology may not reproduce, transmit, save, replicate, or serve as a pass-through for secure test materials. Program planners should always evaluate under what conditions a student will use technology and clearly describe that in the student's plan. An example, if a student uses a magnification device for paper testing, that should be clearly stated in the plan. When assistive technology is not appropriate, accommodations used will be based on student need and ability level as designated in the IEP or 504 plan. Technology should be considered first in order to help foster independence. The goal is for independence to carry over into post-school activities so that the student will be able to participate in home, further education, and in their communities to the fullest extent possible. Manipulatives are allowed on state required content assessments, but are required to be a one-to-one testing environment due to the individualized aspect of the accommodation. The rules for manipulatives, as laid out by the inclusion regulation, are as follows. The card shall not contain any written text or labels for the students not taking alternate assessment. This can serve to help organize the student's thoughts. Manipulative placement during assessment should be consistent with where the placement is during instruction. The student has to choose which one they want to use and when they want to use it. Page 9. Alternate assessment students can have writing and labels on their note card as long as it is not content. Pages 9 and 20. Once developed, visually impaired students can have their 3x5 note card increased to a size they can read. Students should have access to every manipulative included on their student plan, whether it will be used or not. For instance, if a student has 20 manipulatives written down on their IEP, all 20 should be provided to the student on test day, and not only the ones the accommodator feels will be most useful for the content. Here are some examples of acceptable and not acceptable manipulatives. The first example is fraction tiles. The acceptable tiles do not have any labels. The not acceptable tiles are labeled. The next example is a number line. Notice that the blank number line is acceptable, but the one labeled is not acceptable. The third example is of a 3x5 note card. The acceptable note card has visual strategies but no labels. Because it has been used in instruction, it will serve to jog the student's memory on the process of solving a problem. The card on the right has labels such as whole, part, and is not acceptable. The AKSA is a scripted test. Most manipulatives and materials needed for the assessment are included. Students may have a 3x5 note card. Here are some examples of acceptable and not acceptable note cards for AKSA. Notice the difference between the general KSA note card and the acceptable AKSA note card. The KSA note cards may not have any writing on them at all, but the AKSA note cards can include basic labels. The acceptable note card has the labels of first, second, third. but does not contain actual process strategy labels to help a student solve the problem. Each individual test will have manuals and guides that determine how a reader is to be provided within the testing environment. Some assessments allow for a human reader. Some assessments allow for only the use of an online reader. Text to speech or an online reader is allowed for students with an IEP, 504, or PSP. The reader must have been routinely used in instruction. There must be ongoing documentation showing that, despite intervention and high quality instruction, the student cannot access the reading assessment without a reader. This must not be solely due to cognitive deficits or below grade level performance. If the student is EL, the committee must also consider the impact of English language proficiency on reading. Because the state required content assessment is written in English, the reader will be reading all parts of the test to the student in English. The PSP committee must determine the conditions under which a reader is routinely used during instruction before approving its use in state required assessments. Peer tutors may not serve as readers on state assessments. Anyone not working in a certified position must sign a non-disclosure. Here is more guidance for what a reader may do. Keep in mind, these rules apply to any state test given in any format. Any reader must read the directions, prompts, situations, and passages as they are written in the test. The student does not have to request the reader to begin reading. A reader may not use or provide any additional information even if requested by the student. This includes emphatic speech when reading. A reader may reread any part of the test to the student only after the student requests it for students taking the general assessment. The alternate assessment is scripted, and the test is to be read aloud to the student. The test may require administrators to reread specific sections or scenarios. Additionally, test administrators may determine when a student is not focused and may reread at any time. A reader may not point out parts of questions or tasks skipped by the student. A reader may read individual words or abbreviations mispronounced by a text or screen reader if specifically requested by the student. A scribe is an accommodation for students with a verified disability or EL students who have a proficiency level that impacts writing. Each specific test has administration manuals and guides that detail how and when a scribe may be used on that particular assessment. Keep in mind these rules apply to any scribe in any testing environment. A student must have a verified disability that impacts written expression. Examples may include dysgraphia or neurological disorders that impact the motor skills needed for writing. A student cannot be given a scribe just because they have bad handwriting or write or type slowly. The student plan should include data supporting the need for a scribe. A scribe must be used in routine instruction, but should not be a replacement for instruction or technology. A scribe is always a one-to-one accommodation. For an EL student with a PSP, the committee should document the impact that the student's English language proficiency has on the student, demonstrating what they know on a content test written in English. A scribe shall be provided if the student has not reached proficiency on the annual English language proficiency assessment. A district has discretion of who can serve as a scribe, but peer tutors are not allowed. Any person not working in a certified position who is providing assistance shall read and sign a non-disclosure agreement provided by the department. How a scribe records answers for a student may be different from one assessment to the next, depending on testing platform. Whether the test is paper-based or online, the role of the scribe never changes, and the student must always own their work. The scribe is to record what the student dictates word for word. They are to format, capitalize, and punctuate the student's writing as the student directs. After the product is written, the student is to direct any edits or revisions to the work. The scribe should not alter anything of their own accord. It should all be the student's own ideas, revisions, or edits. For online testing, a scribe may click answers or perform functions necessary for technology-enhanced items, such as drag and drop or selecting from a drop down menu of options. On paper, the scribe may bubble in answers as directed by the student. A scribe for an EL student is meant to give the student a way to demonstrate their content knowledge while providing an alternate means for them to express their thoughts and knowledge. The scribe is to record what the student dictates word for word. They may not correct grammar, run on sentences, or organization. It should all be the student's own ideas, revisions, or edits. A student may not write in their native language and then have a teacher translate the written work into the test in English. However, the student may dictate their response in their native language to be transcribed into English on the answer document. These allegation preventions discuss best practices when providing the accommodations just discussed. A human reader may be provided in a small group of up to 4 students. For students using the online reader or text-to-speech function in an assessment, DAX or BAX need to be sure that it is activated for those students prior to the test session beginning. Failure to enable this feature, or conversely, enabling it for students who do not have it on their plan, will lead to an allegation. When scribing for a student, be sure the student is always maintaining ownership of their work. Any assistive technology used, whether it is a communication device, talking calculator, or other technology, must not utilize internet access. If it may be a distraction to other students, such as the online text reader or a talking calculator, headphones may be used or the student may test in an alternate area. It is time for our third check for understanding, which will cover information about the accommodations of technology, manipulatives, reader, and scribe. Please pause the video and take a few minutes to read and answer these yes or no questions, and resume the video so we can discuss. Question 1. May a student who uses a communication device use it for state assessments? The answer is yes. Students using communication devices may use them during the state assessments to communicate with accommodators or test proctors. If there is internet capability, it must be disabled on the device during testing. A student using technology that may be distracting to another student should be tested in another location. Pages 8 and 9 of the regulation. Question 2. Is a number line that is pre-numbered appropriate to use on state assessments? The answer is no. A number line must be blank for a student to use on a state assessment. Manipulatives are meant to serve as something that triggers a student's memory of a process or how to solve a problem. Page 9. Question 3. Does the student have to request the reader to begin reading initially? The answer is no. The student does not have to request for the reader to begin reading. A student taking the general assessment does have to request a reread. Students taking the alternate assessment, which is scripted, do not have to request a reread. Pages 10 and 20. Question 4. On an online assessment, may the scribe click the answer choices for the student? Yes. The scribe may click answer choices, perform functions for technology-enhanced items, and type written responses as directed by the student. Calculators are available on state tests in the online format, handheld calculator, or both forms depending on the test being given. The type of calculator that can be used is governed by the test administration manual for each assessment. To use a calculator, a student must have the type of calculator selected and have an active plan with documentation of a disability's impact on mathematics calculation or reasoning. Have used the calculator in routine instruction throughout the year. If a student has a valid calculator accommodation, then that calculator is allowed on all sections, including non-calculator sections of tests. It should be noted that the calculator accommodation is a disability accommodation, not an EL accommodation. In order for the use of extended time to be allowed during the state-required content assessment, the student plan should include under what conditions a student will need extended time during instruction and assessments. Evaluation information and ongoing progress data will support the need for extended time. The use of extended time on the state-required content assessment shall be utilized as long as the student is demonstrating on-task efforts which allow the student to make constructive progress on completing their assessment responses. Please refer to the test manual for the specific assessment being administered for specifics regarding extended time. Behavior supports are allowed during the state-required content assessment when the student plan includes under what conditions a student will need the supports during instruction. They cannot be solely given during a state-required content assessment. This should be documented with evaluation and progress data. Some strategies used may include positive behavioral interventions and supports as indicated in a student's behavior intervention plan, IEP, or 504. The student may receive verbal, tangible, or tactile reinforcements for being on task, such as a piece of candy or a fidget. The student may also use technology to focus attention or reduce stress. Use of technology for these students does not mean they can automatically use a text-to-speech online reader or the online calculator. It means if a student is given computer time as a reward for on-task behavior, then the student would still be able to receive that reward after their test session is complete. Some students require classical music or a sound machine to help focus or reduce stress. A strategy used for reinforcement or behavior modification may not distract or influence another student who is testing. If it does, then the student utilizing this accommodation will need to be tested outside the general test environment. Please note that students who exhibit disruptive behavior prior to or during testing may be tested in a different location from their peers. This includes students who do not have a behavior plan, IEP, or 504. The Administration Code regulation provides districts the ability to have a plan to avoid disruptive situations in place prior to a test session. This is a local decision. Students who are deaf or hard of hearing who require an ASL interpreter must have a verified disability in the area of hearing and use sign language as their primary mode of communication due to that disability. The student must also use an interpreter during routine instruction. While providing services during an assessment administration, an interpreter may not define vocabulary, provide content, or teach concepts. They should not lead students to a current answer. Anyone not employed in a certified position who is providing ASL interpretation must read and sign a non-disclosure form. An interpreter must not be used in place of technology. Oral Native Language Support, or ONLS, is an administration strategy accommodation for EL students. The level of translation support for each student should be based on the student's individual language needs as documented in the PSP. This may range from translating specific vocabulary to translating all written parts of the content assessment. Directions may be simplified, but test content should never be paraphrased or simplified. To meet the needs for translators, students may utilize a different testing schedule for EL students as long as the schedule falls within the test window. Please refer to the test literature for your specific assessment for details. ONLS may be provided in a small group of up to 4 students. Electronic translation devices such as Google Translate, Pocket Talk, or translation headphones are not permitted. Telephone translation services are not permitted. Anyone not employed in a certified position who will be providing language support services must complete both Administration Code and Inclusion Regulations trainings and sign a non-disclosure. Bilingual or English dictionaries are a processing and response accommodation for EL students. The bilingual or English dictionaries can be in print or electronic versions. Consistent with best practices for ELs, the dictionary used should be a word-to-word translation without definitions. When using an electronic bilingual or English dictionary, make sure that other capabilities such as going to the internet, translating whole phrases and sentences, etc., are turned off before using this accommodation on the state-required content assessments. Again, Google Translate or Pocket Talk may not be used. Electronic dictionaries should be used in a one-to-one setting. Paper dictionaries may be used in a small group setting or in a large group if best practices are taken to ensure this does not cause a distraction to other students who are testing. Here are some allegation prevention tips for the previous accommodations. Check your student calculators with the guidelines outlined in the test administration manual for that specific assessment you are administering. Be sure your staff providing accommodations are fully trained and have signed a non-disclosure if necessary. When grouping students for oral native language support, be aware of their proficiency test scores. A student who requires very little support should likely not be grouped with a student who requires extensive translation. It is time for our fourth check for understanding, which will cover information about the accommodations of technology, manipulatives, reader, and scribe. Please pause the video and take a few moments to read and answer these yes/no questions, and then resume the video for us to discuss. Number 1, may a district group up to 4 students together for oral native language support? Yes. Up to 4 students with the same language may be grouped together. The best practice is to be aware of the translation needs of the students. Number 2, can the same types of calculators be used for all state required assessments? The answer is no. The test administration manual for each assessment specifies the calculator guidelines for each individual test. Number 3, can a student use a text reader as a behavior modification? The answer is no. A text reader is an accommodation for a student who has a disability related to reading or as an EL support. It is not a behavior modification support. Number 4, if a student sleeps for 55 minutes of a 60-minute test, are they entitled to their extended time? The answer is no. The regulation states that the use of extended time on assessments shall be utilized if the student is demonstrating on-task efforts toward constructive progress, found on pages 11 and 22 of the regulation. To recap the inclusion of special populations regulation, all rules within this training and the regulation regarding accommodations still apply to any accommodations provided regardless of testing format. Because students interact differently with online and paper and pencil tests, the way accommodations are provided can vary, but what an accommodation can provide does not change. If you are providing accommodations, it is imperative that you review all testing literature for the test being given and understand how accommodations are to be provided for that specific exam. This can differ widely from test to test. It is never a good idea to assume because you have provided accommodations on one online test that things will be the exact same on another online test. Always read the testing literature prior to administration. If you need further assistance, contact the Division of Assessment and Accountability Support at dacinfo@education.ky.gov before improperly providing accommodations. This concludes the inclusion of special populations regulation training. If you have any questions about anything we discussed or require further clarification, please contact our office by emailing dacinfo@education.ky.gov or by calling 502-564-4394.